Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. I'll wait for my troubleshooter to stop me if I'm doing anything wrong here. Welcome to those online. Welcome to those who've joined us in person. I'm just delighted to welcome our speaker today, Matthew Augustine, who will be talking to us about his book, From Japanese Empire to American Hegemony. So Matthew is a Columbia graduate from the East Asian History program here. He's a historian of Japan, but more than Japan. He's an international historian of Japan and the world, an historian of refugees, of the transnational history of what it meant for World War II to come to a close for individuals in the far-flung reaches of the Japanese Empire as well. It's a very important story for us in Korean history. It's a very important story for Northeast Asia in general and for the world to know. So I'm just delighted that he's here to talk to us about his book that really goes into the depth and the richness of the sources available to us. Matthew is currently, he's visiting the city. He's an associate professor in history at Kyushu University. In terms of logistics, we will be asking Matthew to speak for about 45 minutes about his book, and then we will open for your questions and comments and responses, and that will be both the in-person and the online audience, just to let everybody know that this is going to be recorded as well, and gives me great pleasure to welcome Matthew Augustine.
Thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction, Ruth. I'm delighted to be back here at Columbia. 16 years since I was in this room to defend my dissertation. So first time since I've been back. I'm going to transition over to the podium and prepare for my presentation. Thanks for the technical assistance. I still do need it. Take it out, yeah. Okay. Okay, and I do want to thank Jeff and Judy and others at the Weatherhead Institute for organizing this event. It means a lot to be able to come back to this place and to this space. Yeah. Now. Okay. All right, sorry for the slow start, but I'd like to begin by inviting you to look at the photograph on this book cover. It shows hundreds of mobilized Japanese soldiers who were returning to Japan from Busan about to disembark at the Hakata Harbor. If you look at the bottom, you can also see a smaller number of Koreans who are waiting to embark upon the same ship heading from Hakata to Busan. And what becomes apparent when you look at the original photo. All right. So here's the original photo. Thanks again for your help. Yeah, it becomes apparent that this photograph was taken by a member of the U.S. Army Signal Corps. And that's the corps that accompanied American occupation forces that were deployed in Fukuoka from actually October 10th, I believe, although the photograph is taken maybe a week later. I chose this photo because it captures really the massive scale of people who were post-war repatriation and reflects the physical dimension of decolonization at the initial moment of this transition from the Japanese Empire to the rise of American hegemony. This really was the beginning of repatriation. So you can imagine similar boats making the round trip between Japan, various harbors in Japan and Korea. And my book focuses on the really dynamic but also contentious relationship between migration and border controls in U.S.-occupied Japan, Southern Korea, and the Ryukyu Islands. and it examines the American interlude in Northeast Asia as a closely integrated regional history or trans-regional history. All right. Now, I'd like to provide a bit of basic information about this topic. I mentioned the relationship between migration and border control. So I want to first start by talking about migration. And there were three categories of migrants who resided in metropolitan Japan. There we go. Okay. So this chart, which was made in the post-war period by the Ministry of Justice, gives an idea of who were migrating, the first group, foreign migrants in Japan before the end of the Second World War. And you can see from the figures on the left side, the 1, 2, 3, that represents 10,000 people. So yeah, we think of foreign migrants, you think of Western migrants. But in fact, the largest number was always Chinese migrants. And you can see from Showa 5, which would have been 1925, that there was a kind of a peak of Chinese migrants in Japan as well. This is the first category. Second category are colonial migrants in Japan. And okay. This is based on the same Ministry of Justice report made in the post-war period with statistics. So I've recreated a table there, and you can see by colonial migrants, basically the figures that were available refer to Taiwanese and Korean migrants to Japan. And the bars are not really proportionate. But look at the numbers. Towards the wartime period, 1930s, 1940s, there were over 1.2 million Koreans in Japan, and that number increased until the end of the war. So the figure of Taiwanese colonial migrants much smaller. Now, then there's internal migrants. And there are no statistics that I know of internal migration in Japan. I'm not sure that it was so closely monitored. Yeah, as I have in the slide there, each group of migrants were a heterogeneous group accustomed to circular migration as a way of life. Now, I chose to focus on two different groups, Koreans and Okinawans. And this is perhaps unconventional. The last chart, or it's still up there, to make a comparison of Koreans and Taiwanese seems straightforward, right? They're both colonial subjects of Japan during this time period. But I chose instead to look at Okinawans, internal migrants. And there are two main reasons for that. One was that they were the two largest group of migrants at the end of the war, the end of colonial rule. So you see on the bottom right statistics of various groups of migrants in Japan in 1945. So anywhere between 2 to 2.2, some estimate 2.4 million Koreans were in Japan. And you see that the second one is 200,000 Ryukyuans, right? In quotation, that was a name that was revived by the Americans. Until then, the Japanese always referred to them as, at least the government in official circles, as Okinawans. The second group, or the second reason why I decided to compare these particular groups is because among those other groups of migrants in Japan, these were the two groups that moved back and forth between Japan and their homelands, which were under direct military rule. So all three zones of occupations, these were the U.S., Japan, and Japan, Southern Korea, and the Ryukyu Islands. People were going back and forth, and like continuing the circular migration that they were used to during the pre-war and colonial periods. All right. Now, a bit about In terms of border controls, migration, now I want to talk a little bit about the background of borders and border controls. National immigration measures didn't really apply to travel within the Japanese Empire, right? There were administrative boundaries between metropolitan Japan and the colonies and occupied territories, but these were not, there was no national line, right? Instead, migrants crossed the administrative boundary separating metropolitan Japan, which began to be referred in the probably from the 1930s onwards as Naichi, right? Naichi is as metropolitan Japan included Okinawa at the time, and on the other hand, Gaichi, the you could say colonies or outside territories. And they were controlled, the movement of people between those two sides were controlled by regional police, Japanese police at designated ports. For example, at the port of Shimonoseki and Busan, for example, there was a major commercial ferry service that connected those two ports. Now, then at the end of the war, there are new boundaries that are drawn. They're not national boundaries yet, but the borders, we could call them borders. The 38th parallel is most well known, but there's also the 30th parallel that was drawn not at the end of the war, but in end of January end of January, there was a directive. Then in February, this was enforced. Of February of 1946, there was a line of demarcation that explicitly separated, the Ryukyu Islands from mainland Japan. Now, these the 30th parallel, 38th parallel, both of them divided the Japanese Empire after World War II. Again, they were not national borders. Right? They were administrative boundaries of the military occupations in the region. So in the absence of a national immigration system, and especially because under occupation, Japanese sovereignty was suspended, there were no national immigration control system in place yet. So in the absence of that, then going back to the first slide, the movement of people, the return migration of people that were referred to as repatriation. Repatriation of Japanese and non-Japanese was the only form of migration during the occupation period, and that the occupiers permitted. But then their post-war repatriation program was unexpectedly challenged by the arrival of other migrants from neighboring territories, neighboring occupied territories. And they were then treated as quote unquote illegal immigrants and subject to deportation. All right, so my book explores the really, I think, multi-layered, multifaceted, evolving interactions between a number of actors. There's occupation authorities, there's local officials, there are newly emergent ethnic organizations, and then the individual migrants who cross back and forth between these newly drawn administrative boundaries. So to understand how these interactions contributed to migration and border controls that reshaped Japan and reshaped other occupied territories in the region, I raise a set of questions that explore three interlinked topics: repatriation, but also what happens afterwards, that is the resettlement of returnees, right? And also the third topic, immigration. And I employ a corresponding set of methodological approaches to try to answer these questions. So maybe I can read those questions. What did defeat and liberation mean for ethnic Koreans in Japan? And how do these interpretations affect their decisions to remain in the Japanese homeland or to repatriate to their respective homelands? So in order to answer this question, I used various memoirs, biographies, and print media to explore the subjectivity of these migrants. So an important part of it, the reason for doing that was to try my best to recapture, these voices and the lived experience of these migrants, which have been, until recently, they've been largely excluded from historical narratives of post-war Japan. I also analyze these sources to demonstrate the agency of many of these migrants who, proactively tried to determine their own fate. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. Now, the second question, why, but also how, did the challenging process of resettlement in U.S.-occupied Korea and the Ryukyus contribute to the expansion of a regional smuggling trade and regional smuggling networks? So, in order to answer that question, I compared the stories of reintegration and in Korea and in the Ryukyus, and highlighted some remarkable similarities between direct military rule in Korea and the Ryukyus. I think this is an important point to emphasize because in Japan, the occupation of Japan, this was administered through the Japanese government. So it's often referred to as an indirect occupation, right? And of course, it was an occupation. It was the Allied occupation, no doubt. But many of the policies were implemented through the pre-existing Japanese government, but not so in Korea and the Ryukyus. So this comparative approach helps explain both the push and pull factors of migrants who repatriated from Japan, only to smuggle themselves back to Japan. Also, the approach I've written there, trans-regional framework. I think the framework also helps to explain the cause and effects that tie together this overlapping processes of repatriation, resettlement, and immigration. Now, the third question is how exactly did migrant smuggling, unauthorized immigration, and with the outbreak of the Korean War, then war refugees to Japan? How did this help generate lasting exclusionary migration and border controls in Northeast Asia, in Japan, but also in those occupied territories? So my approach here was to address this last question. This question needs to be addressed in the dual context of decolonization on the one hand, but also the Cold War in the region. So that means I framed the process of creating migration and border control regimes as a transhistorical study, transcending the temporal divide between the fall of the Japanese Empire and the rise of American hegemony. All right, and let's see. Having a little bit of trouble with my computer. Okay, I just want to give say a few words here about key concepts plus main themes and arguments. Now, hegemony has of course many definitions, right? But I prefer to use it in a classical sense, and I apply this concept to the study of American occupations, American power in Northeast Asia after World War II, because I believe the history of U.S. military occupations, they serve as useful sites for examining the rise of American hegemony in the region. So this is actually one of the themes of my study, right? That's military occupation as a basis for American hegemony. Joseph Nye, who passed away a few years ago, he defined the emergence of hegemony when, quote, one state is powerful enough to maintain the essential rules governing interstate relations, end quote. And my reading of policy papers, memorandums and reports that were written and filed and exchanged between occupation officials, they presented the possibility of exploring interoccupation relations, almost like interstate relations, which helped chart the course for American hegemony in the region. So one of my main arguments is the following, and that is the extent of cooperation and coordination among American occupiers, but also the competing jurisdictions and interests of those occupiers. They determined the mixed outcome of using repatriation and deportation as expedient tools for dismantling the Japanese Empire. So, by exploring the extent of America's hegemonic power through a study of migration and border controls in occupied territories, I found that the occupiers also heavily relied on local authorities, and in order to support, in order to regulate human mobility. So the legislation of new migration laws in Northeast Asia it was something that was brokered in this relationship between occupier and the occupied. So that's the second theme that I look at. And I think analyzing the motives, but also the processes and the outcomes of this collaboration between the occupier and the occupied in each of those occupied territories, this is essential, I think, to understand how each side helped create, new categories of aliens, and then negotiated how best to contain them or exclude them in post-colonial Japan. So my argument regarding this theme is as follows, and that is, the heightening Cold War and deepening collaboration between the occupiers and local authorities. They help to co-produce stringent migration laws, and this then in turn generated new kinds of problems, right? And how to distinguish between South Koreans and North Koreans, not just in the Korean Peninsula during the war, but also in Japan, those who arrived in Japan. What about Ryukyuans? Well, what were Ryukyuans? How did you distinguish them from Japanese? How could they be distinguished from Okinawans? Right, two different terms, same people, but depending on where they lived, they were referred to by different names. All right. So now, in answering the first main part, my question about defeat, what did defeat mean to these migrant groups? What did liberation mean? I found that there were a range of reactions to Emperor Hirohito's surrender announcement, and they were really diverse, almost as diverse as the migrants' backgrounds. And here's a book that's, I guess it's been around more than 10 years since publication, but I think it's a very important one. That the two editors are very well-known scholars in Japan. This is the memory of the Issei, the first generation of Korean migrants to Japan. There are 52 interviews, and many of them do talk about that moment of liberation in Japan. Now, there are other sources that I used, and oral history collections written in Korean provide evidence that Koreans in Japan who most welcomed liberation and repatriation were those who were forcibly mobilized into labor and also military service to support the Japanese war effort. So here's an example of that. For those of you who are in Korean studies, you can read the title "Tankoragoyo," right? Tanko refers to the Japanese tanko, the coal mines, right? What were these coal mines that so many laborers were conscripted to work in, and what were their experiences? This is a oral history project, one of many that were supported by the Korean government, actually. And so I won't read the whole quote here, but you can read one such interviewee who is featured in my book. Wrote and said that he was working together with Allied POWs, and the POWs were being released, and there was this, that's when the individual realized that hopefulness that they could return. They refused to work anymore. They demonstrated, and he says, Korean. They demanded to be returned to Korea, that this was their fervent wish, and they would not work until they were returned. All right, now there are other sources that I looked at, and that is, there are other biographies. Here's a very interesting biography, and is featured in my book. But this one, Chang Jong-soo, was very active in one of the ethnic organizations that were established after liberation, and he wrote that and now he was a long-term Korean resident, and he was just as eager to return to Korea, but ended up staying behind to help organize, to organize these self-governing associations, and which prioritized helping compatriots return home. And the idea was that only when that mission was accomplished, then they would go back. He ended up, spending the rest of his life in Japan. All right, now moving on to Okinawans, I think, there are a whole bunch of oral history collections from the 1970s and 1980s. And this particular one is from the city of Naha, but Okinawa Prefecture has a whole a series. And the Naha one really is a collection of those who lived through the Battle of Okinawa to the end of the war, in the post-war period. But it also features the experience of some of those Okinawan migrants who were in Japan at the end of the war. So for Okinawan labor migrants, but also war refugees, there was a sense of deep-seated resentment against Japanese society for often treating them as second-class citizens, and their feeling that the Japanese state willingly sacrificed Okinawa in the battle, right, during the war, and those kind of feelings drove many to begin to reassess their identity. Would they identify themselves as Japanese or not? And here's some quotes. Again, I won't read over everything, but just a sense of bitterness, I think you can tell from the bold letters there. That he was tearful, not because of Japan's defeat, that he was in tears because of what happened, the great sacrifice in the Battle of Okinawa that obliterated his homeland. And then, the resentment. As an Okinawan, he predisposed to being anti-Japanese for, again, this word, in his words, this poison that spread, that Japan spilled in Okinawa, and which had, poison that spread from early modern period, all the way down to the end of the war. Now, other Okinawans were even more explicit in welcoming their emancipation from Japanese rule, and also the enforced assimilation. So here's not an autobiography; it's actually written by Miyazato Eiki's son, but he uses the word emancipation and liberation. right? So he was also part of this Hogen Donso. There's this debate in the 1940s about whether Okinawan, whether this was a form of Japanese dialect, or was it a language? I mean, he had very strong feelings about his identification as being Okinawan first and foremost. But yeah, he you could see in red. He said he was afraid at the end of the war. He was kind of thrilled, but he was afraid to express it out in public, right? He was afraid that this might bring about problems in the community. He was an evacuee in Kumamoto Prefecture, a war evacuee to avoid the Battle of Okinawa. And he felt in his rendering he said that he told other evacuees that the history of Okinawa was full of oppression. But now, they were liberated, and Uchinanchu is an Okinawan for a way of identifying them. So Okinawans could live as Okinawans, right? All right. Now, turning to the issue of these migrants' agency, I want to emphasize the effectiveness of the newly formed ethnic organizations that help facilitate the massive rush of return migration. So in the aftermath of war, Japanese authorities concentrated on selectively deporting only those who served in the military, but also labor, as labor conscripts, and neglected the rest. So priority was placed on returning those people quickly. But these newly formed Korean organizations assisted a much larger number, an estimated 500,000 compatriots, by not through official repatriation channels, but chartering small fishing boats and help to return them to Korea in what's been described as a spontaneous mass exodus. So the League of Koreans then emerged as the most influential actor in occupied Japan and succeeded in repatriating, but also in negotiating with the Japanese government. Initially in good faith, negotiating with the Ministry of Transportation and also the Ministry of Welfare to take charge of all practical matters relating to the repatriation of Koreans. And it also engaged in a prolonged struggle to help ensure that those who remained in Japan would officially be recognized as liberated people. Now, the League of Okinawans, which consciously modeled itself after the League of Koreans, also advocated repatriation and also the pursuit of greater autonomy, at least in Okinawa. Now, they identified themselves as ethnic Okinawans, so they called themselves the Okinawa Jin Renmei. Okinawa Jin, that means Okinawan people. The League repeatedly criticized the Japanese government for its indifference to the plight of fellow islanders who were stranded in Japan and unable to return to their home islands for over a year after the end of the war. They sent multiple petitions to General MacArthur. It helped to win the sympathy of SCAP, which is Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, the occupation administration that was set up. SCAP then was more sympathetic towards those Okinawans, but they referred to them as the Ryukyuans. So they were sympathetic to the plight of Ryukyuans, and as a result, Ryukyuans were included in the mass repatriation program that began in 1946, and they were registered. Ryukyuans were registered for this repatriation as non-Japanese, right? So they were included along with Koreans, Chinese, and Taiwanese who could repatriate as non-Japanese. So the meaning of defeat and liberation continued to evolve over time, but the identity politics of the leagues contributed to ethnic segregation in Japan that accompanied the end of the war and dissolution of the Japanese Empire. All right. Now, in addressing the second question that I posed in my book, comparing the three U.S. military occupations in the region, it really does reveal remarkable similarities between occupied Korea and the Ryukyus, and that helps to explain why so many people ended up smuggling themselves or being smuggled with the assistance of others back into occupied Japan. Now, at the most basic level, in contrast to the meticulous wartime plans that were laid out by the State Department, and the Pentagon for defeating and occupying Japan during the war, there was a lack of it. You could say a glaring lack of concrete plans for occupying Korea and the Ryukyus. So General John Hodge, he was the commander of the U.S. Armed Forces in Korea, but he publicly declared on the day that the U.S. Army military government in Korea was established, that their task, purpose of the American occupation was to enforce the Japanese surrender, the terms of Japan's surrender, and to ensure an orderly administration would be established in Korea. Now, also, another factor is that most of the civil affairs officers were originally trained for the occupation of Japan, and they were poorly informed and without much guidance to suggest, solutions for U.S. policies towards post-liberation Korea. There were military government schools that were established during the war, including here at Columbia University. I think it was the U.S. Navy for that one. And yeah, they were trained to become civil affairs officers, to go to Germany, Japan, but Korea was not one of them. So many of those, were trained for Japan, ended up in Korea. Didn't know much about the country. Now, another key factor that's important is that, in contrast to the indirect occupation of Japan, as I said, no civil government existed in Korea and the Ryukyus, which were governed by direct U.S. military rule. All right. I'm guessing this is a part that will be of most interest to those of you who are doing Korean studies. So I do want to cover this. Now, in Korea, General Hodge refused to recognize the Centralized Committee for the Preparation of Korean Independence, CPKI, and the local level people's committees that were established. And those organizations, as has been written, a lot by Bruce Cummings and others, they worked together to try to find an interim government before the Americans even arrived on the scene. Now, given the intense political rivalries that characterized post-liberation Korea, American occupiers just floundered, in their search for reliable local officials, and the measures that were put in place were ad hoc measures. In search for reliable local partners or officials. And this was made more difficult and contributed to the deepening chaos and instability that characterized that time period. I think again, in contrast to Japan, there was this Americans were in rush to establish a new government, to bring about free market capitalism, but this led to all kinds of problems. There were strikes. There were unions that wanted to be recognized, and made all kinds of demands that were not met. Now, in this context of instability, many repatriates then escaped from the brewing kind of civil turmoil, political, economic, social turmoil at the time. And they, I won't go into the details, but there was the October People's Resistance, 1946. There's the Jeju uprising in 1948. And for many people who had just resettled to return to Korea, this was too much. This was not the liberated homeland that they had hoped to return and rebuild their lives and to help contribute to rebuilding the country. So many of them then escaped to Japan. Now, the theme of inter-occupation relations provides another useful means for, as I said, looking at and measuring the cause and effects of the connection between the problem of migrant resettlement and illegal migrations, smuggling, human smuggling. So, for example, the U.S. Army military government officials were critical of SCAP's customs regulations that were implemented as a part of the repatriation program. So one of them in particular was this limitation that repatriates could only carry back 1,000 yen in currency. And that's, and whatever little they could carry on their backs, right? And that was just, it wasn't enough for repatriates who arrived in Korea to live more than a week off of that money. So they repeatedly, the military government, the liaison offices repeatedly requested that SCAP try to relax the strict limitations because they were contributing to really the destitute condition of many repatriates who had to live off of the black markets in Busan and other port cities in Korea. So poor coordination and cooperation within occupied Korea also proved to be another problem. So, for example, several efforts of the military government indicated that the 40th Infantry Army Division, 40th Infantry Division of the Army, assigned to supervise repatriation and resettlement in the port of Busan, they felt that their responsibility was limited to processing them at that port, and the rest, they were on their own. So as a result, Busan became congested with Korean returnees who couldn't find their way back. They couldn't afford to pay for train tickets to go back. Many of the trains were not running properly, and they ended up settling again in and around that port, other ports, and living off of a combination of rations from the military government and black market activity. So this, that black market activities was not limited to the port. It became connected with the smuggling of goods and people between Japan and Korea. Now, I think if I am running out of time, then I might skip what I was going to say about the Ryukyus. Should I, or what's that? Talk about the Okinawa too. Okay. All right. So, right. Now, in the U.S. occupied Ryukyu Islands, like in Southern Korea, actually, American officials had to identify, and also train local authorities to assist the military government. But there were very few people that had administrative experience. So shortly after the war, the U.S. military government in the Ryukyus selected 15 local officials or local leaders, actually. I think even less than half of them had any kind of administrative experience. And others who had worked in the Okinawa prefectural government had fled before the Battle of Okinawa. And those who remained, were captured as POWs. So the military government assembled leaders who were chosen in camps, in refugee camps, war refugee camps, to form this Okinawa Advisory Council, and that's the photograph that you see there. And in the following spring, in April, a local educator, Shikiya Koshin, was appointed governor of the newly inaugurated civil administration. Now, unlike the U.S. occupied Japan, and even unlike occupied Korea, resettlement in the Ryukyus actually began during the war. So the Battle of Okinawa really necessitated the relocation of approximately 300,000 more, 300, maybe 20,000 war refugees throughout Okinawa. And that were divided into district camps, and all of them, had to rely on imported U.S. military rations. So I mean, this was a high degree of dependency on the U.S. military in the Ryukyus, and yeah, that dependency was more acute and lasted longer than in Japan or in Korea. So the resettlement of these war refugees took a long time. Uh, yeah, and so that those who had to wait, the military government had to help relocate war refugees within Okinawa before they could accommodate larger numbers of repatriates coming from Japan, from Micronesia, other parts of the former Japanese Empire. And so in many cases, they had to relocate from one camp to another, literally living in tents for many months or even longer. So that means that repatriates and those refugees, non-repatriates alike, they really became displaced refugees in their home islands. All right. So I argued in my book that repatriates in occupied Korea became kind of an underclass. Many of them who didn't have a home to go back to or work to find, but in the case of Okinawa, this was not even an underclass. This was practically everybody became refugees. And I think the problem was aggravated by the strict constraints that were put against any kind of mobility, even within the Ryukyu Islands. It was divided into the northern Ryukyus and the southern Ryukyus, and travel to and from or between those islands were restricted. So yeah, I think you can imagine just this sense of isolation and dependence. It wasn't just a sense; it was very real, and many felt it was too much, that they had to find their own means of improving their livelihood, and those who could afford to do so really did live on the black market, participate in it, and by extension, perhaps go to Japan. Or there were different routes. There were those who went to Taiwan. After all, from southern Ryukyus, it's much closer to go to Taiwan than Japan. All right, now there's the last part of my study about migration controls in Japan. But what do you think? Should I cover that last point? I'll wrap it up in. Okay, great. All right. So the third main question that I pose in this question, that's the theme of well, the approach of looking at collaboration between American occupiers and the local officials is key to explaining the construction of strict migration control regimes. So here I'll just limit myself to Japan. There were other regimes, migration regimes established in occupied Korea and the Ryukyus as well. But in occupied Japan, this was not a straightforward collaborative process. As easy and tempting as it would be to suggest so. So for that reason, it actually there were twists and turns, there were ups and downs, right? Back and forth negotiations between or throughout the occupation period. So for that reason, I think it's useful to divide it into kind of 3 stages. Okay. Now, in the first phase, there was a naval blockade of occupied Japan, and that became clear when there were immigrants beginning to challenge, kind of reverse the repatriation program, and there was a blockade. There were policies that were implemented specifically to outlaw, to ban any kind of immigration to Japan at the time. The pre-existing colonial surveillance system, that is the Japanese Kyowakai, the Koseikai, right? That was dismantled in November 1945. So then, what could serve in place to try to control migrants arriving in Japan? and Korean migrants in Japan in particular. Now, initially, authorities used food rations, actually, ration passbooks to be able to distinguish between Korean residents who were there from before the war versus those unauthorized migrants who arrived in Japan after the war. But this proved ineffective. There was forgeries there. This became kind of a business, a thriving business, actually, to forge such ration books. There were those in the countryside, who moved into the urban center without permission, even, so they had been in Japan for years, but they didn't have those ration books. So when that didn't work, then the Japanese Home Ministry decided to implement a Korean registration. This is specifically targeting Koreans. And that was implemented in Osaka in November of 1946. Now, this effort was not effective. It was defeated by an anti-fingerprinting campaign because this involved fingerprinting. And those who protested said, hey, this is just like the Kyowakai system. Kyowakai issued fingerprinted identity passbooks to Koreans who lived in Japan in the colonial period. And they said, we are liberated peoples. We shouldn't have to be subject to this kind of surveillance again. So yeah, the League of Okinawans spearheaded this anti-registration process. So that didn't work very well. Now, on the other hand, the Home Ministry did succeed in, say, collaborating with Korean specialists in SCAP's government section for enacting a nationwide alien registration system. So it was not specifically targeting Koreans, and it did not include fingerprinting, but it did mean that all non-Japanese, who were called non-Japanese at the Repatriation Administration, to register, and there were consequences for not doing so. And of course, this was not just to keep track of how many alien registrations or aliens were in Japan, but also specifically to make sure that those who didn't carry those passports could be deemed illegal aliens, and they could be interrogated and ultimately deported. Now, second step, stage from 1948 onwards, the deportation of Koreans became closely linked to the increasing preoccupation between American and Japanese authorities in, the Cold War context, that is the containment of the spread of communism. This corresponded to the so-called reverse course in occupied Japan, which emphasized rebuilding Japan's economy, but also strengthening its military forces, right? So there was a series, in that context, there was more collaboration between each side to try to target so-called subversive elements in Korea. And there were a lot of people who were affiliated with the League of Koreans or otherwise who were protesting over various issues. There were violent incidents in 1948 over education. Maybe some of you know about this, the Hanshin Toso, it's called. There were ethnic schools that were established, and SCAP actually said, well, agreed with the Japanese government to say, no, this is a place where indoctrination is occurring, communist indoctrination is occurring, and yeah, it's a hotbed of communism, they said. So they had to be closed down, and of course there was great resistance leading to violence. Then there was an effort by Prime Minister Yoshida, who returned to power. Yeah, and I won't go over this very long. I'm running out of time. But he said that there are 1 million Koreans in Japan. Half of them are, well, most of them are criminals. Half of them are illegal immigrants. There's no statistics to prove this, but he said the Japanese state will, with its own resources, deport all Koreans in Japan. Now, this was rejected by SCAP, rejected by MacArthur. Now, but the trend changes, and here's the third phase. From mid-1949, occupation authorities became increasingly determined to reshape Japan's migration laws in the image of the United States. So I think it is fair to describe this as a process of Americanizing migration control systems in Japan. The opposite, some of these terms were used in occupied Korea. Koreanization of, some of the policies that the American occupiers were trying to implement. But yeah, long story short, there were advisors coming who had, were very familiar with and involved in the U.S. government's internal security act that was passed, and they played a key role in making this a much more centralized migration system, and which allowed for this great amount of discretionary authority for Japanese immigration officials to deport not just illegal immigrants, but also those who committed crimes in Japan, those who were suspected of activities injurious to the occupation officials, but after the occupation ended, then anything that was deemed a threat to the Japanese state. All right, so I think I will end with just a few things to say. Yeah, please. Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, so just to explain the significance of this study, in my conclusion, I compare migration and border controls between U.S. military occupations in Northeast Asia with the counterpart of what was going on in occupied territories after the war in Europe, Central Europe after World War II. I also include a postscript on what happened to Japan after the occupation ended in 1952. And I discuss the expansion of American hegemony, but also the curtailment of that. I don't want to overemphasize that this was absolute, power or authority that lasted for so long. So I hope that my treatment of this topic on migration and border controls in American occupied territory really demonstrates some of the advantages for doing transnational or transregional history, as well as the relevance to contemporary affairs. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Thank you. Take this from you. And just say thank you very much, Matthew, for the layers and the richness of this talk. Thank you, everyone, for the questions and for engaging. Thanks to those online. And please join me in thanking Matthew and you all.